Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is brought to you by REL Northwest, the Regional Educational Laboratory at Education Northwest, and is titled We Belong in School, Interventions to Promote Social Belonging for Educational Equity and Student Success. Before we get started, I'd like to show you a couple of tips for navigating our WebEx interface. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a drop-down menu with both a chat window and a Q&A window. We invite you to use these features throughout the presentation. If you'd like to make a comment, please do so in the chat window, and you can decide who you would like to see your comment by using the drop-down menu in the Send To field. And if you have a question that you'd like to submit for our Q&A section at the end, please do so in the Q&A window. First, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about REL Northwest. We are one of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the U.S. Department of Education. We are based at Education Northwest, a private nonprofit educational research organization in Portland, Oregon. We work with 5 states to support schools, districts, and state policymakers with needs they are facing. As you can see from our map here, our 5 states are Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. My name is Shannon Davidson, and I'm a researcher here at Education Northwest with a special focus on topics related to social and emotional learning. I'll be collecting your questions throughout the online chat platform, say that 10 times fast, throughout the webinar, and I'll facilitate the question and answer section after our 2 speakers have concluded. Our first speaker is my colleague, Dr. Karen Lewis, who is a researcher at Education Northwest and a fellow with the Strategic Data Project at the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. And Dr. Lewis's scholarship in particular focuses on the importance of belonging for women in STEM fields. Dr. Lewis is going to begin by giving us a broad overview of the research on belonging and illustrate some of the links between belonging and a range of academic outcomes. And then we're going to be pleased to introduce Dr. Dave Pawnescu, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Stanford University Project for Education Research that Scales. Stanford PERTS is an applied research center that partners with schools, colleges, and other organizations to develop practices to improve student motivation and achievement on a large scale. PERTS' team of research collaborators includes many of the leading scholars in the area of mindset and belonging, including Dr. Pawnescu, Carol Dweck, Greg Walton, David Yeager, Joe Bowler, and Jeff Cohen. And today, Dr. Pawnescu is going to go more in depth on some of the empirically supported interventions that promote belonging and discuss how educators, counselors, and mentors can practically apply the principles behind these interventions in their own settings. Here's our agenda for the day, and again, I encourage you to participate by submitting your questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A windows throughout our presentation. Our objectives for the day are to define social belonging, to introduce some of the research linking social belonging to academic outcomes, to discuss some of the empirically supported interventions that promote belonging, and to suggest for you some resources and information to use in your own educational setting. And I know we have a broad range of participants joining us today, from teachers to state departments of education, and we're really looking forward to a lively discussion with you. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to our first speaker, Dr. Karen Lewis.
Thank you, Shannon. Hi, everybody. We're really excited to be with you today and getting to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is social belonging and how it relates to academic outcomes. Now, this is a topic that it might seem a little bit funny to define for people because we are also intimately aware of our own belonging status. You probably have a really good sense of what this means already. But for the purposes of clarity, I will put forth a definition that we can work with today, and that is belonging is feeling like an accepted and valued and legitimate group member. Now, a really important point of this definition that I want to stress is the feeling like part. Belonging gets at people's subjective perceptions about their connections with other people, and these perceptions can and sometimes do diverge from what seems like objective reality. And what I mean by that is that you might think someone who's very connected in clubs and friend groups at school might feel a really strong sense of belonging, but that person might still be experiencing exclusion or loneliness. And we really know it's that their subjective perceptions of whether or not they belong that are really more important and have more punch than those objective indicators. Belonging matters because we are inherently social creatures, and we have a really strong need to form and maintain positive connections with other people. Psychologists even theorize that we have evolved this need given our connection to groups has been so critical in our survival as a species. So in other words, it really seems that we're hardwired for seeking out connections with other people. And research has shown that we're very finely attuned, constantly, and whether that's consciously or not, to our belonging status. So we're constantly picking up on and reacting to cues when our belonging might be at risk. And these cues don't necessarily need to be as outright as someone giving you the silent treatment. They can be even very subtle. So for instance, research has shown that we're sensitive to things like a lack of eye contact or brief interruptions and lulls in the flow of conversation. And even these very small cues can make people feel less of a sense of belonging. Belonging also matters because feeling as though one doesn't belong, feeling excluded or rejected, is a really painful experience. And there's been extensive research on this topic that has established a real laundry list of the psychological and physical consequences people experience when their belonging needs are not met. So for instance, in terms of the psychological consequences, we know that feeling a sense of exclusion is linked to things that might not surprise you, such as sadness and anger, decreased self-esteem, but we also know that exclusion has other psychological consequences, such as the impaired ability to self-regulate and poor cognitive functioning. Exclusion and lack of belonging has also been linked to a range of physical consequences. For instance, we know that loneliness or having fewer social connections than one desires poses the same level of health risks as things like smoking and drinking and even obesity. So it's really a high risk factor for mortality. Now, the study of belonging and research in this area originally came from the context of understanding close interpersonal relationships. But we know that the importance of belonging really cuts across all aspects of daily life. And because education, of course, is rich with several and many different ways of complex interactions and relationships with other people, we think that this is a really important context to think about how people's belonging might impact their outcomes. And we think a belonging framework can be a really useful tool for better understanding young people's experiences and outcomes in academia. And as we'll see, asking questions about what it's like to be a student in this class, in this school, in this program, with sense of belonging in mind can help us reach a better understanding of many of the educational inequities that persist in our society. Now, just as some of the research I mentioned before on kind of a general sense of belonging is linked to better well-being, we know that if we hone in and get a little bit more specific and consider young people's sense of belonging within their school, we also see that this is linked to important outcomes. For instance, the National Longitudinal Study on Adolescent Health has shown that sense of school belonging is linked to positive health outcomes, such as a decreased risk of substance use and early sexual initiation, even violence within schools, and decreased risk for suicidal ideation and disordered eating. We also know that school belonging is linked to a host of positive academic outcomes that we all hope for with the young people we work with. And these are things such as increased self-efficacy and higher motivation. We also know that greater school belonging is linked to better attendance and more persistence, and even better objective achievement. So this really paints a picture of how having a strong sense of belonging in schools is really linked to the best possible outcomes for young people. Now, because belonging is a fundamental need, we know it matters all across the lifespan. However, there's some particularly key moments that are relevant to our discussion today that I want to highlight when belonging matters particularly importantly. So first of all, adolescence is a time when belonging seems to be important. This is a key transition in young people's lives when they are becoming increasingly independent from their parents and negotiating new peer groups and relationships, and belonging is more salient. Another key consideration is when people are in times of transition. We tend to be particularly fragile and vulnerable at these times, and what I mean by a time of transition is when people start a new school, transition to a new grade, go off to college. These are times when new social ties must be formed, old social ties might be fading away, and uncertainty about whether or not we belong is introduced. So really these are the times when we are particularly likely to pose this question of, do I belong here? Now, this question of do I belong here, when people feel uncertainty about that question, it can potentially trigger a really pernicious recursive process that I want to describe. And what I mean by this is that when people ask themselves, do I belong here, and the answer is, well, I'm not sure, we know that people in this case become more vigilant. They are more aware in their environment of cues that signal whether or not they belong. In an effort to answer that question, do I belong here? And people become more vigilant and are picking up on cues that they might necessarily not notice in other circumstances. So things like a classmate who doesn't say hi in the hallway, a teacher who canceled a meeting unexpectedly, getting a poor grade on a quiz. These are events that everyone encounters from time to time, but when you're uncertain of your belonging, these normal events can be interpreted in the worst possible light. So that classmate that didn't say hi in the hallway, it's because she hates me and I don't belong here. What's more, this feeds back into this process that when these cues are interpreted in the worst possible light, people just get more unsure in their belonging, and this kind of recursive process can just keep going on until people become, feel such a lack of belonging, they become less motivated and engaged. In contrast, when people feel more positive about their belonging, they're less vigilant. They're picking up on fewer cues, and the cues that they might be picking up on are given the benefit of the doubt. So those normal circumstances that people encounter, they're no longer really indicative of a sense of belonging. The friend in the hallway that fails to say hi, well, it's just because she was busy. And in turn, we see that this recursive process happens again, but now that's further bolstering people's sense of belonging. And based on the research we've already reviewed, we know that students who are feeling a stronger sense of belonging are more motivated and more engaged and are even performing better. So really when people feel this strong sense of belonging, we're seeing the best possible outcomes. And that's why we've chosen to focus on belonging today, because we feel it's really a critical place for educators and people working with young people to be aware of.
Thank you, Karen. Before we move on to our second presenter, I wanted to take a quick opportunity to field a question that came in from one of our participants. This participant would like to know if social belonging has any special importance for certain groups of students, particularly students of color, students living in poverty, or English language learner students.
I think that's a great question and is really relevant to this discussion about belonging, because we know that dominant cultures can be more inclusive of some students than others. So students from the groups you just mentioned, English language learners, also first-generation college students, stigmatized minorities, they're going to be more likely to question their belonging because they often have less evidence that people like them actually do belong. So if we imagine what it's like, for instance, for an African-American student in a predominantly white school to ask himself, do I belong here? When he's looking around to see peers, teachers, administrators that are all mostly white, then I doubt the answer to that question is going to be a resounding yes, this is a place where I belong. And I think it's instead more likely to experience uncertainty about belonging, which feeds into that cycle I just talked about. What's more, I think that question of do I belong here can become even more global, and it becomes do people like me belong here, which I think can trigger stereotypes and processes like stereotype threat that we know just have really harmful consequences for students. So I think that question is spot on in terms of why we want to focus on belonging as a really important variable to understand about students.
Okay, thanks. And I think Dr. Paunescu is going to go deeper into some of those questions as well. And I'd like to remind participants that they may submit questions at any time using the Q&A window on the right-hand side of your screen. And with that, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Dave Paunescu from Stanford PERT. and I'm going to pass the presentation over to him.
Just unmuting.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm here. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So again, I'm Dave Ponescu, and today I'll be talking about what educators can do to promote student sense of belonging in school, and how by doing so, they can enhance educational equity. I'd like to start by thanking Karen for providing an excellent introduction to belonging, and to the Northwest IES Regional Education Laboratory for inviting me to speak today on such an important topic. So my talk today follows a rather simple outline. First, I'll try to explain why it's so important for educators to focus on belonging if they care about educational equity. And then I'll describe three distinct research-based strategies for improving students' sense of belonging. Okay, so why talk about social belonging if you want to improve educational equity or promote student success more generally? Well, there are at least three important reasons. First, as Karen eloquently described in her presentation, a sense of belonging is one of the most fundamental human needs. Feelings of isolation are one of the strongest predictors of poor health and well-being, and if students are denied a sense of belonging in school, they will be miserable and distracted there. School won't be a place where they want to spend their time or invest their effort. To the contrary, they'll want to avoid school and anything that reminds them of school. The second reason it's important for educators to attend to students' belonging is because it's within our power to improve it. Research shows that the decisions we make as educators about how we structure students' experiences in school and our relationships with them can have a profound effect on students' sense of belonging. So if we want students to succeed in school and to be happy there, we should pay attention to how our actions or our inactions are likely to make them feel about that context and their belonging there. Finally, last but by no means least, it's especially important to focus on belonging if we want to fix inequality. A large body of research shows that gaps in students' sense of belonging contribute to gaps in achievement, such as the gap in grades and test scores between white and black students across the United States, or the gap between men and women in the rate at which they pursue careers in science, math, and technology fields. Fortunately, research also shows that we can substantially improve outcomes for students from historically underrepresented groups by helping them to develop a stronger sense of belonging in school. As I'll describe today, interventions that improve students' sense of belonging in school have decreased racial achievement gaps in colleges by close to 30%. They've halved suspension rates in middle schools, and they've substantially improved the grades and attendance rates of at-risk high school students. But you may be wondering, how could interventions to improve belonging lessen achievement gaps? When people talk about achievement gaps usually, they rarely talk about the gap in belonging. Instead, we more commonly talk about structural inequality and about discrimination. To give just a few examples, students from historically underrepresented groups generally have less access to expensive learning resources and to educated parents who can provide invaluable at-home tutoring and model how to navigate the school system. They also have less access to social networks that can help them with prestigious internships through letters of recommendation, or even just by showing them what kinds of career paths are possible for them and what role school might play in those paths. On top of all of that, students of different races, social classes, and genders must often contend with biased expectations and unequal treatment from teachers, from administrators, from classmates, and even from parents. That is to say, the deck of opportunity is stacked pretty heavily against students from certain groups. So that means that if we care about educational equity, then clearly we should do what we can to address the discrimination and the socioeconomic inequality that are at the root of achievement gaps. However, it would be a terrible mistake to think that we can only address educational inequality by tackling these factors directly. Indeed, given how hard it is to change structural inequality and discrimination directly, focusing solely on these factors would virtually ensure the progress is slow and that little is done in time to help the students who are in school today. So what can educators do to promote educational equity in their schools today? Well, one thing we can do as educators is look for other drivers of educational inequality that might be easier for us to influence directly. And one of those drivers is the gap in belonging. In fact, one of the most pernicious legacies of discrimination and structural inequality is the fact that they can lead students from historically underrepresented groups to question their belonging in academic contexts. Experiences with discrimination and inequality and widespread stereotypes about intellectual inferiority can lead students to worry that important others in school don't accept them and won't accept them. They can lead students to worry that no matter what they do, they will always be rejected by or seen as lesser than by others in academic contexts. These concerns are captured in the following quote from an accomplished Black student reflecting on her time at Princeton University. She writes, "My experiences at Princeton have made me far more aware of my Blackness than ever before. No matter how liberal and open-minded some of my white professors and classmates try to be toward me, I sometimes feel like a visitor on campus, as if I really don't belong. It often seems as if, to them, I will always be Black first and a student second." These words were written by Michelle Robinson, who many of you may know better by her married name, Michelle Obama. From personal accounts like hers, it's easy to see how isolating it can feel to be different in an academic context, even for the very best students surrounded by people who are trying to be supportive. Of course, the feelings of isolation that she describes are troubling in and of themselves because of their implications for health and for well-being. But research shows that these types of feelings can also act as a psychological barrier that makes it harder for students to develop good relationships with classmates, good relationships with classmates and with instructors, or to perform at their best academically. For example, Professor Rudy Mendoza-Denton and his colleagues have studied students' worries that others might reject them because of their race. They have found that the more worried students are that others will reject them because of their race, the less likely they are to reach out to others and form the types of positive relationships with peers and with instructors that are so crucial to developing a secure sense of belonging and to doing well in school. So why might students be worried about discrimination? Well, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. It's perfectly reasonable for minority students to be anxious that they might be discriminated against, because without a doubt, they do get discriminated against on a regular basis. In fact, sometimes the discrimination is disturbingly violent and blatant. However, it's often ambiguous why something bad happened. Maybe a person is being cold towards you because they're biased against you, or maybe they're just having a bad day. It can be really hard to be sure, and given the prevalence and the visibility of prejudice, it's not hard to imagine why a student of color may be inclined to assume the worst, or to be anxious about the possibility. Yet research shows that this anxiety can in and of itself lead to problems. There are a lot of ambiguous interactions at school, and constant social anxiety can make it really hard to develop good relationships and become comfortable in a setting. In this way, a high degree of anxiety about discrimination can make students distracted and unapproachable, hurting both their studies and their relationships. In one study by Rudy Mendoza-Denton and colleagues, Black college students who were extremely anxious about being discriminated against on a in day-to-day situations were also less likely to have positive interactions with their professors and with their peers. These students who were highly anxious also earned worse grades over the course of their college careers. In this way, their completely understandable anxieties led them to act in ways that ultimately hurt their own prospects. In a different study, David Yeager and his colleagues surveyed the Black graduates of a high-performing urban charter network. All these students had been accepted to college, and they were asked the degree to which they sometimes worried that they may not belong in college. It turned out that the more students agreed with that statement, the less likely they were to actually enroll in college full-time the following fall. Importantly, this difference held even when controlling for high school GPA, for SAT score, for gender, and for a number of personality differences. And I think these findings really underscore just how important it is for educators to provide all students with a secure sense of belonging. Because when our sense of belonging is insecure, our own anxieties about not belonging can act as an additional psychological barrier that makes it harder to succeed and to connect with important others. So, what can educators do to reduce students' belonging concerns? Today, I'll talk about 3 research-based strategies. As I talk about each, I'll describe some of the research supporting the effectiveness of the strategy. And then at the end, I'll point you to additional related resources and approaches that might prove useful to educators who want to improve their students' sense of belonging. So the first strategy I'll talk about today is all about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of what happens. It relates to the kind of belonging uncertainty and the scanning and the vigilance that Karen talked about in her presentation. Many events have ambiguous meanings. When you get a bad grade, when you don't get invited to a party, when you get critical feedback on an essay, you need to make sense of that in some way. And the way you make sense of it can have a big impact on what you think you should do next. For example, if you think you got a bad grade because you're stupid and you won't ever succeed in school, then you might be tempted to drop out or work less hard in the future. After all, what's the point of working hard if you're sure you'll never succeed? You may recognize this as a classic fixed mindset interpretation for a setback. On the other hand, if you think you got a bad grade because you haven't learned the right study strategy yet, then you probably think you should ask someone for help, learning a better way to study for this topic. You may recognize this as a classic growth mindset interpretation for a setback. Or let's take a different example, a social example. If you think you weren't invited to a party because the host hates you or is biased against you, then you may be tempted to ignore her or to be mean to her in the future. On the other hand, if you think you weren't invited because the host was too shy to ask you, you might decide to strike up a conversation and get to know her better. Of course, all students experience setbacks, and all students can benefit from a more adaptive interpretation for the ambiguous setbacks they encounter. However, students from underrepresented groups face 2 additional burdens when setbacks are concerned. First, the unequal footing they're starting from because of discrimination and because of economic inequality means they're more likely to experience setbacks frequently, certainly more frequently than their advantaged peers. Second, widespread inequality and discrimination provide a plausible and highly salient and negative interpretation for ambiguous events. For example, let's imagine a rich white student receiving criticism from her instructor. She might worry that her instructor thinks she's personally a bad writer because of the bad essay she wrote. But many Black and Latino students might additionally worry that their instructor is biased against them because of widely held stereotypes against their groups. Now, this is really important because it can feed a harmful feedback cycle. These kind of cycles can build over time. If students interpret a setback as a sign that they don't belong and won't be accepted, it can make them less likely to try to form trusting relationships with others and with instructors. This in turn can make them less likely to try their best or ask for help when they need it. And this reduced effort and increased isolation can in turn make additional negative experiences more likely. And those additional negative experiences may, of course, then further confirm their fears that they don't belong. In this way, this cycle can perpetuate itself. Well, guided by an understanding that the narratives students use to explain their setbacks are so important, Greg Walden and Jeff Cohn developed and tested an intervention designed to change the way new college students interpreted setbacks. Now, all college students, in fact, all students encounter setbacks during the transition to college. And it can be easy for everyone to feel alone and to interpret those setbacks as a sign that you don't belong. but it can be especially easy if there are lots of other cues to suggest that maybe you don't belong, such as the fact that you're the only person who looks like you. Well, the goal of the intervention that Greg and Jeff designed was to arm students with an alternative positive narrative for the setbacks they would encounter. The intervention they developed uses testimonials from upper year college students to convey the idea that almost everyone worries at first about whether or not they belong, and that these worries pass with time. In other words, the intervention aims to arm students with an adaptive interpretation for setbacks, so that when something bad does happen, they don't feel alone or unfit, and they can more easily shake it off as a temporary situation that will pass. One that doesn't mean they don't belong. Here's an example of testimonials from the intervention from an upper year student. When I first got to my school, to my college, I was worried that I was different from other students. Everyone else seemed so certain they were right for this college, and I wasn't sure I fit in. Sometime after my first year, I came to realize that many people come to this college uncertain whether or not they fit in. Now it seems ironic. Everybody feels they're different freshman year from everybody else, when really, in at least some ways, they're all pretty similar. Again, the goal of this intervention and these testimonials was to provide students with a new interpretation for setbacks so that they avoid the harmful feedback cycle that may otherwise form. In their seminal study, Walton and Cohen found that Black college students who had been exposed to these more positive narratives did indeed seem less likely to fall into this negative feedback cycle. These students reported believing that they have more potential to succeed in college over time. And they also reported engaged study behaviors. For example, they reported more visits to instructors' office hours, higher attendance in review sessions, and more hours spent studying. They also reported better health, suggesting that they were suffering fewer of the negative health effects associated with the feelings of isolation that were common among control group students. Finally, they also found that the Black students who had been randomly assigned to the belonging intervention earned higher grades over the course of their entire college career. This suggests that this targeted intervention was able to change students' narratives for setbacks and prevent the harmful feedback cycle that may have otherwise formed. Now, importantly, the positive effects of these interventions on achievement have been replicated at a number of universities, including Stanford University, the University of Texas at Austin, and the University of Illinois at Chicago. In these studies, almost all the students in the entire incoming class were randomized to an intervention condition during the college onboarding process. Relative to the control condition, the social belonging interventions improved important outcomes for students from multiple underrepresented groups, including Black students, Latino students, and white first-generation college students. At Stanford, they improved GPA, reducing the achievement gap by around 26%. And at the University of Texas, they increased the rate at which students from underrepresented groups enrolled in college full-time, reducing the gap in full-time enrollment by 37%. These promising findings have spawned the creation of an entire new collaborative of over 24 colleges and universities working together to test out where, how, and for whom these types of interventions can improve outcomes. I'm hopeful that we'll learn a great deal over the next few years about how to bolster students' sense of belonging through this type of intervention. However, you don't have to wait. You can already take steps as an educator to provide students with a more positive narratives for the setbacks they're likely to encounter at your school. Of course, there are many different kinds of setbacks and many different kinds of narratives to explain them. Here are a few of the key messages to keep in mind. One is that difficulty is normal and that it passes with time, that it's not a sign that you don't belong. This is an especially important message at times of transition, when students are less secure in their belonging and more likely to interpret negative experiences as a sign that maybe they don't belong. A second key message is that mistakes are perfectly normal and an important part of learning. Students will inevitably make mistakes, and they will be much more likely to learn from them and to see those mistakes as okay, rather than as a sign that they don't belong. If you set a clear norm in your classroom or your school, the mistakes are something really useful, something that we all make, and something that we can all learn from. Some of you may recognize this as a practice that promotes a growth mindset. And it's worth noting that school cultures and practices that promote growth mindset also tend to promote belonging, because they explicitly challenge the idea that only certain kinds of people can be successful. A third related message is one that is especially important to provide to students in combination with critical feedback. Of course, critical feedback is an absolutely crucial way to help students improve, but it can also provide an ambiguous signal to students about belonging. It could be a sign that their instructor is biased against them or thinks them incapable. So as an educator, try to remove that ambiguity. Explain that your standards are high and that you're giving them this feedback not to make them feel bad, but because you believe that they can reach those higher standards. In other words, make it easy for your students to trust that your feedback is coming from good intentions and that you're there to help them grow as a scholar. That's why you're putting in the time to give them feedback. That disambiguating your motives for critical feedback in this way and for what they should take away from it will make your students more likely to learn from your critiques and less likely to worry that your criticisms imply that you don't like them or that they don't belong. Now, I have a really important caveat about these messages. These messages should not be retold to students verbatim. These shouldn't be expressed robotically. Students will be far more likely to accept these messages through an authentic, respectful dialogue, one that enables them to connect to these messages in a personal way. The specific way you do that will, of course, depend on your student's age, on their context, and on your personal relationship with them. Maybe you can initiate a class discussion about belonging, or maybe, if you feel like you really understand your student's perspective and have a good relationship with them, you can share a personal story that you think will resonate. Whatever you do, try to make it obvious to students that you respect their feelings and their perspectives. And that leads us into our second general strategy for fostering belonging. And that is to foster and develop respectful, trusting relationships between students and instructors and between students and each other. Of course, respectful, trusting relationships matter to all students, but students from underrepresented groups have more reason than most to worry that their instructors might not trust or respect them. This is something that my colleague, Jason Okonekwah, has studied extensively in the context of disciplinary practices. His research has spotlighted how zero-tolerance policies lead many educators to adopt a punitive approach towards student misbehavior, and how that punitive approach combines with educators' implicit biases to feed a deeply troubling cycle of mistrust, misbehavior, and far too often, incarceration. In one line of studies, Jason Okonekwah, Greg Walton, and I focused on the role of respect in teacher-student relationships. Having been teenagers ourselves, we knew that respect is something that all teenagers crave as they start to assert their independence. Unfortunately, we were also keenly aware that many school practices are anything but respectful. To the contrary, they're often coercive and punitive. They constrict students' independence severely and treat them like hardened criminals if they choose to assert their independence by defying rules. We reason that this punitive approach towards discipline is probably self-defeating because harsh, uncaring punishments further alienate students and disrespect their sense of autonomy, which is exactly why many students misbehave in the first place. In one of our studies, we sought to test our prediction that being disciplined in a harsh, uncaring manner would lead students to report diminished respect for school authorities and an increased desire to misbehave in the future. We asked students to imagine that they're in middle school and that they disrupted class by repeatedly walking around to throw away trash. In one condition, students were asked to imagine that their teacher, Mrs. Smith, gives them a detention and sends them to the principal's office. This is a rather punitive approach for such a small infraction. In the other condition, which we call the empathic discipline condition, we asked students to imagine that Mrs. Smith instead asked them what was wrong and that she moved the trash can closer to them, presumably to accommodate their need to throw away lots of trash. Well, what we found was consistent with our expectations. When students imagined that their teacher had treated them with respect and caring, even when they misbehaved, they respected her more and were more motivated to behave well in the future. Of course, this is just a study in which students were imagining these scenarios. So we wanted to test whether this would have an impact on real student behavior. To do so, we developed what we called an empathic discipline intervention. This intervention tried to convey several key ideas to middle school teachers. First, it reminded teachers that adolescence is a really tough time, and that students aren't terrible people just because they misbehave. For example, we made the point that the social and biological changes of adolescence can make middle school students really insecure, that their worries about being treated in an unfair way can cause them to experience lots of stress, to overreact, and to disengage from school. We also reminded teachers just how important respect is to teenagers, how much it can mean to teenagers, or to anyone for that matter, when an adult treats them with respect, especially in their darkest hours. We tried to remind teachers that it is within their power to help students develop into more secure young adults who feel valued and respected in the school context. For example, we asked teachers to read student testimonials, and one of these testimonials read, "One day I got detention, and instead of just sitting there, my teacher talked with me about what happened. He really listened to me. It felt good to know that I had someone I could trust in school." In this study, 31 middle school math teachers were either randomized to this empathic discipline intervention or to a control condition that was focused on how to use technology in class. We collected data from 1,580 students who these 31 teachers collectively supervised. What we found surprised even us. We found that the students of teachers who had been exposed to this empathic discipline intervention became half as likely to get suspended as the students of control group teachers. The overall suspension rate dropped from 9% to 4%. And importantly, the percent reduction in suspension rates was biggest for the groups of students who had the highest rates of disciplinary problems. For boys, the rate went from 15% to 8%. For African American and Latino students, from 12% to 6%. For previously suspended students, it dropped from 51% to 29%, a drop of over 20%. It's also important to note this effect was not driven by the treated teachers becoming pushovers. Student suspensions are initiated by math teachers so infrequently that there's literally no way that the effect could have been driven by their math teachers simply becoming, quote, too nice to refer students for suspension. Rather, it would appear that the better relationships that troubled students formed with their math teachers provided a lifeline of respect and understanding that these students desperately needed. By feeling heard and respected, even by one teacher, these students became less likely to misbehave in school more generally, and they became much less likely to get suspended. Again, trusting, respectful relationships are a key to belonging, and the way to develop these relationships is to listen to students and to show them authentic respect. Keep in mind, it doesn't matter whether you think you're respecting students. It matters whether they think you're respecting them. And teenagers don't always make sense to us adults. So ask them how they're feeling and help them see you as a person that will really listen to them and to their perspectives. Okay, the last strategy I'll discuss today for increasing belonging is to help students relate to school. Maybe it's a bit of a no-brainer that students will feel like they belong in school more if they can relate to what they're learning in school. But I don't think it's always obvious how to help students relate to school or just how important doing so can be for them. Curricular choices send a powerful message about who belongs in school and whose stories matter. Do students get to read stories about people who look like them or about events and experiences they can relate to? I'd like to read some powerful words from Isaac Nieblas, a son of Mexican immigrants who was interviewed recently by San Jose Inside. In the quote, he describes the experience of taking an ethnic studies class for the first time. He said, "Learning about the Chicano Revolution and the 1960s made me feel as though my concerns, my issues, my humanity were legitimate. I felt more enthused and I was having more conversations because I knew that my people were just as smart as anyone else. Having that understanding revamped my perception of who I was as a person and as an intellectual being." Notably, Mr. Nieblas grew up in Arizona, where ethnic studies classes were banned from the high school curriculum while he was a sophomore. And to paraphrase him, the fact that his prior schooling had not exposed him to his own heritage in an academic context had deprived him of a sense of legitimacy for his concerns, his issues, and even for his intellectual abilities. Now, a recent paper by Tom Dee and Emily Penner of Stanford University assessed the impact of an ethnic studies course empirically. They found that at-risk students who had been assigned to take this course across multiple different San Francisco schools earned GPAs that were 1.4 GPA points higher, and their attendance improved by 21 percentage points. These recent quantitative findings reinforce the conclusions of a large qualitative literature, which attests to the transformative impact of curricula that enable students from underrepresented groups to see themselves and their experiences celebrated and examined in the school context. Of course, even if you cannot institute or teach a full ethnic studies curriculum, you can find other ways to incorporate rigorous content that students can relate to. For example, you can check out the resources developed by Teaching Tolerance and Facing History and Ourselves. And more generally, if you want to share content with students that they find personally relevant, it's a really good idea to ask them what they want to learn about. They'll be more engaged by content they're interested in, and your interest in their opinion will signal your respect for them more generally. Okay. Finally, I'd like to thank you for your attention and to leave you with two final thoughts. First, when students feel like they belong, they're happier, healthier, and more academically successful. Second, it's within your power to help more students feel this way. I hope you'll use this power wisely, and I hope I've provided you with some useful insights about how to get started. If you'd like to learn more, you can check out the PERTS Mindset Kit at the URL up on the screen. So thanks again for your attention.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you to both Dave and Karen. We have a couple of minutes left to fill a few of the questions that have come in from our participants. Someone was curious about the issue of tackling cultural mismatch in the classroom, or for instance, perhaps a teacher is a different culture or a member of a different race or ethnicity than students. How might belonging come into play into an interaction like that?
I think that's a great question. I think, as we talked about earlier, when students, their belonging can really be more likely to be uncertain when they don't feel that similarity to their peers and their teachers. But I think it's often one really simple way to combat that is to focus on our similarities. I think it's, of course, important to celebrate differences, but we also know from some recent research from Hunter Gelbach, So the paper coming out in the Journal of EdPsych, they did a really interesting manipulation where they provided students and their teachers with some real feedback on some similarities that they had. So these were kind of personality traits, shared interests, simple stuff, but they found that getting that information about the ways they were similar seemed to boost their relationships, and really the teachers perceived stronger relationships with their students, and they even had higher achievement at the end of the term. So I think that one way for teachers to be aware of that mismatch and to seek out ways to really emphasize the similarities they have with their students might be one way to combat that belonging uncertainty and make people feel more comfortable in their classrooms when they don't necessarily have the same cultural background.
Dave, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that is a really great question. I mean, I think that Karen's answer was great. I would just add just how important it is for students to feel respected and heard, and to listen to their concerns, to try to have conversations with them, to ask them about their lives, and to try to understand what it is that they're interested in. To really show them genuine interest and respect. I think that all students appreciate that, but I think it's especially powerful in situations like that.
Okay, great. Another question was about consistency and how educators can work to ensure consistency of practices with interventions. Or is consistency always desirable?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we want to be consistent in the messages that students take away from interventions. When we want students to walk away feeling like they belong, having the right kinds of narratives for right kind of understanding for what's going on, for why they're experiencing setbacks. We want them to walk away feeling respected and valued. So that part we want to be consistent. What students take away, we want to be consistent. But the way to get that consistency is, of course, going to be different for different groups of students. The way you communicate respect and valuing to a 7-year-old is probably really different than the way you do it to a 20-year-old. So I think it's important to be really thoughtful about how to reliably get change, help students feel like they belong. But I think that the actual mechanics of how that's done, it just functionally can't be consistent for different kinds of students, just because there's such variability.
Yeah, that makes sense, Dave, because, I mean, for that message to be impactful, I think it has to be truly authentic to students' experience and what it is about the context they're in that's making them feel like they don't belong. So because every context is different, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all message that people should be kind of using.
That sort of gets to the content of a couple of other questions that have come in about different age groups. We tend to talk a lot about high school students transitioning into college. Can either of you comment on the state of the research when it comes to adult learners, perhaps who are going back to community college, or early childhood, kindergarten, or K through 5 age groups?
That is
yeah.
a big question.
Sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I was thinking of one study in particular from Greg Walton showing that it takes very minimal kind of conditions to make people feel a sense of belonging, and this was some work he did with younger students. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Dave, I think it was even elementary students that they were put into these groups, and the groups had very little actual structure. They were just kind of setting up a group and having students identify with that group, but even those kind of connections help them feel a stronger sense of belonging, even very early on, and with even the most subtle kinds of cues to groupiness.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's also, I think one technique that was popularized by Elliot Aronson in the 1970s, actually. It's called the jigsaw classroom. I think that's a technique that I think is really easy for people to look up, but it involves forming groups of students and having them do group work together. But the group work is structured in such a way that that students really had to help each other. And it had really marvelous effects on both majority group members and minority group members, improving grades, improving empathy and understanding for each other, improving belonging. So yeah, and that was done with grade school students. So yeah, so absolutely, I think these things are really important for students of various different ages. I just think there are different kind of approaches that make more sense because they have different kinds of concerns in those contexts.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and read this last question, which I think may be the last one that we have time for. I'll just read it verbatim. The question reads, this does seem like it's built for the dominant culture. Isn't there quite a bit of research around the importance of having diversity through the school structure?
Sorry, what was the last part of that question? Diversity through the school structure?
Throughout the school structure.
I'm not sure if I understand that question.
Or I think what you might be asking is some of this research is trying to come up with strategies for students that are in the minority in their schools. So maybe an African American in a predominantly white school. So I think what you're asking about is what about schools where there is a lot more diversity, where you might not have such stark minority status for an individual. And I don't know of any research that specifically addresses that, but that would be fascinating if people feel a stronger sense of belonging when there is more multicultural presence in their schools and settings. Do you know of anything, Dave?
I'm not familiar with anything on students of color specifically there. I have read some work on all-female schools and STEM. And I think often in contexts where it's all girls, it's easier for girls to not fall prey to stereotype threat or to feel like they shouldn't be in STEM classes. So I think that at least in some studies, those kind of schools that were structured in a way that made stereotypes less relevant could in fact be protective. But again, I don't think that's, I mean, I think that's certainly one strategy, but I think that even in more traditional schools, there are things we can do to improve outcomes. I don't think that those things are, I think that's one approach, but I don't think it has to be done that way. I don't think something that drastic is fortunately, I don't think it's necessary because that would be very hard to implement.
And one more just comment that I will read. Someone was asking about suggestions for nonprofits who work with students outside of school, so in out-of-school time settings. And this is something that Karen and I have worked with youth development workers in our Oregon region with. And there are certainly ways that interventions can be adapted for out-of-school time settings. And Karen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that's a hard one because you're talking about how to help students in one setting transfer their belonging to a different one. And I think this is a really broad answer to your question, but I think that one thing out-of-school time programs can often be good at is helping students develop this kind of mindset of themselves as a learner. And the more we can foster that, I think the more comfortable and connected students will feel within achievement contexts. And I hope that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Also, I think as far as this kind of belonging transfer process is concerned, I think that's one area where the strategy of providing positive narratives can really be helpful. In one of the studies that I didn't have time to present today, the graduates of a charter school network were assigned to do one of these interventions while they were still before they arrived at college, and even though they hadn't arrived there yet, just kind of being able to forecast for them what that experience would be like, and to kind of help them understand that yes, there would be challenges, but no, those challenges wouldn't mean that they don't belong, seemed to really help them a great deal and substantially increase the percent of students who actually persisted in college. And again, I think a lot of these findings have come out of work with older students, but I think they apply just as well to younger students. It's just different kinds of outcomes and slightly different approaches that you might need to use, slightly different messages.
And lastly, someone was wondering about measuring social belonging. This is a very big question, and it's a very emergent part of the research, which we unfortunately won't have time to go very deeply into today. But we realize that that is a growing concern for educators and youth development workers in our region, particularly given the new focus on non-academic or non-cognitive factors for accountability with our new Education Act. Karen, do you want to add anything briefly?
Yeah, I would add that when thinking about measuring belonging, there are two ways to do this. You can measure people's kind of absolute level of belonging, so that's items like, I feel like I fit in here, I feel like I belong here. But what we know from research is that what's more impactful for outcomes is people's uncertainty about their belonging. So those questions kind of take a slightly different form, and you ask people things like, how often do you feel uncertain whether you belong here? And those it seems like a small distinction, but that can often give you more information if you are assessing people's uncertainty rather than their absolute levels of belonging. And perhaps we can post some links to different scales along with the slides that we'll post to this, because there are lots of options out there that people can sort through. I would also add that it's important to keep in mind the target of belonging, whether you're concerned with people's belonging within their school or their belonging within a specific class. Those aren't necessarily one-to-one coupling, so we have to be very specific with the target of interest there.
And I certainly hope that's a topic we can all come together again in the future to discuss. But in the interest of your time, I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and to ask you to please take just a few moments to fill out our feedback survey. The U.S. Department of Education and we all value your feedback very much. And we will make these slides available on our website. And we thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.